Assalamualaikum everyone. This is me, Sindh Bar, your host for the day. As you know, on Mondays we talk about reimagining education and how much education has actually evolved and changed during this period of time. Even when we're talking about pandemic, this was a very good initiative that we actually brought every educationist, all the mentors out there together. It can be internationally, nationally. We just wanted people to come together and talk about their achievements, talk about how much they have achieved in life, what is the career that they're taking, and what are the initiatives for a person who's especially in universities that they should have in mind, because the passion in a person is something that takes them forward, and that's something how we actually look up to. So if I talk about passion, I have a very good host with me, guest with me today. Hi Joe, how are you?
Hi, nice to be with you.
So Joe Henrich is actually the professor and chair of human evolutionary biology, Harvard University. He's conducted field work on Usawa Island for most summers between 2013 to 2011. You worked on cultural evolution and its implications for both today and the future, and you're the author of The Weirdest People in the World: How the West Become Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. So this is a very fascinating book if I talk about it. I was actually very, amazed to look at the title. A very chosen well. So talk about your career, Joe. How did you start? Why human evolution? What was the idea behind it?
Yeah, well, when I got started in graduate school, so I went to graduate school in cultural anthropology at UCLA. And so I started doing field work in the Peruvian Amazon, working with a group called the Machiganga. And I was studying economic decision making and how people were using the forest and what kind of crops they planted. And I became dissatisfied with the available theories that were from anthropology. So after finishing my master's in that program, I started kind of reading really broadly. And I became convinced that, we had to take an evolutionary approach to understanding humans. But then we also needed to be able to explain the kind of cultural nature of our species. So much about what people do and believe and interact in our institutions are transmitted from one generation to the next as children learn from people in their community and from parents and from peers. So I needed to think about an evolutionary approach that included this kind of the cultural nature of our species. And Rob Boyd, who was a professor at UCLA, was kind of working on this. So I began collaborating with him. And then to that, I started reading widely in economics and political science. So things like using simple experiments from psychology or behavioral games from economics, where people have to divide up sums of real money, became part of the toolkit I was putting together to be able to think more clearly about how psychology varied, how it affected decision making, and how institutions affect psychology.
So talking about how psychology works and how it contributes on decision making. Decision making is something very important if you talk about even in our university life. We make decisions every day, and somehow we're confused because it's all new. We really don't know how to start off with it. So, Joe, what are those basic concretes that you actually see that are the basic foundations of a good decision making, or how our decisions should actually be more profound?
Well, that's a pretty tough question to answer because I think it really depends on the individual. So, if you're thinking about kind of career decision making in university, one of the advantages I had in going to graduate school in anthropology is a pretty risky thing career wise, just because there's not a lot of jobs in the field. And so there's some chance you'll get a PhD at the end and there won't be any employment for you in your field. So it was risky, but I had been an aerospace engineer before going to graduate school. So I knew that if things didn't work out for the anthropology side, that I could always fall back and go back to my engineering job in Washington, D.C. So that was an advantage. So I kind of just went for it, and I did things that were unorthodox and I went way outside the lines of things that cultural anthropologists were supposed to do. So I started using experiments and evolution and trying to write down equations to explain human behavior, all of which cultural anthropologists didn't traditionally do, and mostly still don't.
So, talking about how traditionally things were, and now you've actually taken a little different side from it. I've seen you have a whole what should I say, book about it, and now you've actually published it. But tell me more about the book. I want to know. First of all, it's a really cool idea to have something that is out there that's completely different from what people are actually following, and to then make a book on it, it must have taken a lot of effort. So it's not easy. Being a literature student, I know it's very hard to talk about, or to even publish something. It takes a lot of work. So talk about it. How did the weirdest people in the world came into being?
Well, so when I was had been a professor at Emory University in Atlanta, and I was recruited to Canada to the University of British Columbia. And when I was recruited there for various reasons, I ended up with a split position between psychology and economics, just because my work had been broad enough that it began to inform these other fields, and I published some papers there. So when I got to the University of British Columbia, there were two key things that happened. One is in economics, I was an economics professor, so I had to teach an economics course. And so I taught a course called The Poverty and Wealth of Nations. So since Adam Smith, economists have been asking the question of why there's differences in how wealthy different countries are. And so part of the course was a review and a development of ideas, including work by Jared Diamond, on why there's this interesting variation amongst countries in national wealth. And then meanwhile, in psychology, I began collaborating, or at least having lunches initially, with two cultural psychologists, Steve Heine and Aronor Zion. And what we realized is that in each of our fields, if you did psychology experiments in different populations, not only was there interesting cultural variation in how people thought about the world, how they reasoned, how they perceived things, but that the subjects most commonly used by psychologists were at the end of the distribution. They were unusual in a global perspective. And we had all been working in different domains. So then we began to wonder, is this a more general feature? So over the next 4 years, so from about 2006 to 2010, we tried to conduct a review of all the evidence in experimental psychological related fields, including economics, political science. And we found that, 96, most of the work done by psychologists and others was focused on one population that was psychologically unusual. And so that led to us publishing a paper in 2010 called The Weirdest People in the World with a question mark. And so we began to challenge the existing approach used by psychologists, which was reliant mostly on university students in Western countries, and suggesting that we needed a much more global approach to consider the kind of full range of psychological variation across the species. And then I spent the next decade trying to figure out where that variation came from, and how we could explain it.
Talking about a decade and talking about how much you've worked for it, you must be really passionate, because it takes a lot of effort. First of all, you put those 4 years into just putting that paper up, and then afterwards, you took a decade to actually finalize and think about how. So, Joe, the compilation of the book, if we talk about it, what are those key elements that you actually found out about human psychology that was completely amazing for you, and you were like, I did not expect this to come out?
Yeah, so some of the things that emerged from comparing people's psychology across societies were differences in individualism. So how much people focused on themselves, their attributes, and their aspirations over their relationships. So links to families, cousins, extended relationships, the kind of relationships that you acquire at birth, as opposed to those you go out into the world and meet new people and make new friends and that kind of thing. So that seems to vary a lot. That's related to how people think about themselves. So psychologists distinguish the independent self from the interdependent self. It's related to things like experiencing shame versus guilt, how much overconfidence you are, or overconfident you are. So how good you are relative to others in value domain. So those kinds of things vary. Something called analytic versus holistic thinking varies. So both are really useful types of thinking, but one focuses on objects and tries to assign properties and explains things based on those properties. So, physics is highly analytical, at least at its foundation, because you pick out properties. They can be planets or particles, and you assign them properties, and that explains things. Whereas more holistic thinkers focus on relationships and the interconnection. So if you're trying to explain how people are behaving, analytically, you would focus on the personalities or the dispositions of the people. Whereas if you're doing it holistically, you would think about the relationships between people. Is it a father-son relationship, or is it a peer relationship, something like that?
I kind of, I was, first of all, a lot of words for me, because for me, I was like, what? Holistic and then analytical, and then thinking about it all together. Now it makes sense. Talking about a holistic person, I believe I am one of those people, who actually look at this. I think majority would be that. Maybe I'm wrong. You can correct me. So, what are those key things that you believe uh, should be there when you are taking up in your relationships or taking up in your human interactions, that you believe that now this is the part missing, and why we, the weird people, that are the different people, exist.
Um, what? So I might be two different questions in there. Let's see. So do you? So I mean, one of the things I personally took from this kind of 10-year-long study and studying all this psychological variation is just the value of taking alternative perspectives. So I tend to be quite analytical in my orientation, but knowing that you can sometimes step back and say, well, let me think more about the relationships. Let me think about the broad canvas and the contexts. And so it can really help you there. Um, you know, one of the things we also find is conformity. So weird people tend to be nonconformist, and it varies across populations. And some populations are much more conformist. And American psychologists in particular have always been surprised by conformity. So it's a big part of the textbooks because they're all shocked that people would do what others want them to do. But in other places, that's not so surprising. So my colleagues who work in Japan they're not impressed by conformity.
Okay. So talking about your work and how you have different people in different, what should I say, cities and different countries, and you all are working together. Uh, how do you all come together and talk about? Because this is something very interesting, especially for me now that I've started my research paper. I somehow kind of know how you guys are following, because I'm doing my master's in English linguistics, and my domain is completely linguistics. I talk about human interaction when it comes to language. I talk about how people are talking, how people interact, how people, when they're not talking, when they're just giving you a nod, what does that mean? It's a very complex and a very, what should I, psychological, and I would say a little semantic way. You, on the other hand, you actually focus on all the things. Like, you look at how people are going analytically to holistically, and then you have a whole team that works together. So talk about your team. How do you guys all come together, and how do you amalgamate all this information?
Yeah, so that's one of the big challenges, and it's very much project based. So I work with different teams, and those have kind of changed over the years depending on the project. So way back when I first started, actually while I was still a graduate student at UCLA, we got a grant from the MacArthur Foundation, and we put together a team of anthropologists. So here the idea was to, anthropologists didn't typically do experiments. And meanwhile, there'd been a bit of a beginnings of a revolution in economics and behavioral economics to do more experiments, to have people make decisions with real monetary costs and benefit. So what we did is we brought together anthropologists who had experts in very different field sites. So from hunter-gatherers in Africa, slash and burn agriculturalists in South America, just a variety of different populations, reindeer herders in northern Siberia. And so we brought together all these anthropologists, and we kind of discussed the experimental games, and we decided to do a group project where we would all conduct the same behavioral experiments in these different field sites. And so that led to a few different rounds of that project, and gave us some new insights into how people, how they do decision making with regard to strangers. But then later projects, we assembled different groups. So right now I'm interested in history and how to use historical data. So we're trying to put together a project bringing together historians, anthropologists, and psychologists. So one of the keys is to build collaborations and relationships, and try to you can't be an expert in everything yourself, so you have to rely on your friends.
Yeah, I really like the idea that you said that you cannot be an expert in everything, and how, you all come together and talk about it. Uh, First of all, it's a very good initiative to bring so many people together, and then afterwards, really focus on how humans are evolving, and what exactly are the, basic concepts and which is conundrums that are bringing us forward. Talking about, your, if I talk about your teaching life, because you're an educationist as well. So how much do you think that as a teacher at Harvard, as a teacher at UCLA, as you're talking about, so what have you noticed now, the pandemic that has just shifted education, that has shifted the whole side of education? As an educationist, what do you have to say about it?
Well, I guess the main thing. So I taught a course called Genes, Mind, and Culture this last semester, and I had Zoom classes, so everything's online. I had the students watch the lectures before, and then most of our classes were discussions or kind of small group activities dealing with the lectures. We had some guest speakers as well. And I actually thought it went pretty well. So there's a few things I'll definitely take later into the non-pandemic world, into the future, using more class time for discussion, doing the lectures online ahead of time, I think was pretty effective. I don't know if I'll do it every time, because sometimes I need to update the lectures. You got to keep the lectures fresh with the latest findings. But yeah, so that's something I'll take into the future. The biggest thing you miss is the after class conversations, the office hours where you can interact as people in the same physical room. So the virtual world maintains a kind of social distance that at least I wasn't able to get past very easily. But there are some advantages.
There are some advantages. I've been interviewing people for almost now, it's going to be, my fifth month. And in these 5 months, what I have seen in people, if especially the mentors, they talk about the achievement or, the good part of this pandemic that has brought forward. Even right now, you're talking about that, yes, there was a little difference when I talk about, the after class conversations or how I interacted with my students. But there was a very, very special part that actually built on to our studies, because now we know that we can actually sit home and still study. That gap, what should I say, gap of financials, gap of monetaries somehow is ending, because now people are coming closer, more easier. Me and you, I am in Pakistan, you are over there in Boston. We're talking and we're completely, on the same page right now. That's how the gap is ending. So I also do believe, as an educationist, for me, I can now teach my students who just went to USA back home, they went to Dubai, because they had problems. They were like, we cannot stay here. We have family there. We just came here for studies. I totally agree to that point as well. But how much do you think that now we are actually, opening up? We're opening our schools. We're opening our universities, colleges. What is that one thing that you believe that is going to, really affect our psychology? Because I believe it will leave a mark on us and all of us. What is that one thing? Because now you are talking about it, you have researched about it, you must have seen the difference.
Yeah, well, the Weirdest People in the World deals with this research a little bit. In the book, I focus on the effects of warfare and earthquakes and kind of shocks like storms. But new research actually from an economist in my lab named Max Winkler shows that pandemics have similar effects, is that they make people tighter, more concerned about norm adherence, and more concerned about a tighter social circle. So that could have some bad effects that kind of, if you're trying to get people to cooperate at a larger national or international level. So I think that's the tricky thing we're going to have to navigate coming out of the pandemic.
That's not 100%. So I believe that one thing that I will learn from this is that when I go to my university after this, I make sure that I interact with more people, and I somehow, end this gap, as you say. Thank you so much, Joe, for your time. I really appreciate it. You took out time, and I know I woke you up a little early, and I hope I haven't troubled you. But this is all our, best wishes from Greenwich University to you, and we wish you all the best. And we hope that we see another book coming, and and with way much more detail. And I hope you take some of our anthropologists as well from Pakistan.
Okay. All right. It was great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Okay, so this was Joe Henrich from Harvard University. He is the book author, The Weirdest People, and how I'm really amazed about how much the gap between all of us has finished, and how much interactive now life has become because of technology. And I would love to, wonder and explore more in this field, because I believe that the world in technology and the world that now we're going to live in is not going to end. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I really appreciate it. And if you have your comments, if you want to talk about anything, please let us know. Give us your suggestions, and we will definitely talk about more things in the future. This is Nisan Sinwar signing off. Allah Hafiz.